Good morning and welcome to our next AIM2Learn session. My name is Matt Minner. I'm with Catalyst Connection and with my colleague Tom Reed. And here today we're with Netizen and Michael Hawkins to talk about the CMMC 2.0 update. So welcome, Michael.
Thanks. Appreciate you having me.
Yeah, no, glad to have you and look forward to hearing from you. And before we get started here, we'll just, as usual, run through a quick overview of AIM Hire for any new participants on the line who may not be familiar with our program and what's going on. So the AIM Hire Consortium is a program funded directly by the Department of Defense, the Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation. And Catalyst Connection is the lead organization on this project that's focused in Southwest Pennsylvania and West Virginia on strengthening and expanding the DoD supply chain. We have a strong focus on the adoption of advanced manufacturing technologies and highlighting the new and critical technologies such as cybersecurity that we're going to talk about today to our manufacturers and providing a range of benefits to those in the supply chain and those that are eager to take advantage of opportunities in the defense space. You can see the wide range of partners that we have on AIM Hire, from economic and workforce development organizations, technology institutes, and many of the region's outstanding universities. One of the key aspects of our program is to really showcase the immense amount of capabilities that we have within our manufacturing community right here in the Southwest Pennsylvania and West Virginia region. And so we've created a supplier capabilities database that allows not only suppliers that are looking to subcontract out work, but also, upper tier OEM and defense organizations to be able to identify and find resources within the region. And lastly, you can see some of the regional impact that we've had. We really focus in on the new technology investments, retained and new sales, and of course, jobs created. Well over 300, nearly 400 jobs have been created and retained as a result of the efforts of our partners in this program. And just a plug for our next AIM2Learn session, which we do hold twice a month. And next we'll be talking about AR/VR for manufacturing, so augmented reality and virtual reality and many others from Robert Morris University. Will be on January 26th, again at 10:30. And you can always access at any time on demand the AIM2Learn recordings. You can go to the AIM2Learn site within the AIM Hire website, which is aimhireconsortium.org. So with that, I will be making Mike the presenter here. And Mike, I'm just switching that over, so you'll be able to start sharing your slides, and I'll let you take it from here. And as he's getting set up, if you do have any questions, please post them in the chat or the questions window. We'll be taking them throughout the presentation, as well as at the end. We'll certainly save some time for questions as well. And I'll just try, if there's some applicable ones as you're talking, Michael, I'll just chime in, or otherwise we'll just connect at the end.
Perfect. Sounds good. I appreciate it. Yeah, thank you very much for having me here today. I do appreciate it. Any time we can get the word out about CMMC and what's coming down the pike is beneficial for everybody. I will apologize a little in advance. Last night I developed a little tickle in my throat, so if I pause and take some drinks and stuff like that, I just apologize in advance for that. But so we'll get right into it. We're going to talk about the new updates to CMMC today. We're going to talk about what generally CMMC is, what it's designed to do, what its intention is, and why do we even have it in the first place. We have a lot of companies, especially in this region, that feel like they don't really apply to the DoD. That they're not going to have any issues. They might not even realize that the DoD is in their supply chain right now. But CMMC is going to complicate a lot of things, but it's also going to solve a lot of issues going forward. So again, I'm Michael Hawkins. I'm with Netizen Corporation. I'm the CEO and founder. And Netizen's been around about 10 years now, going on this our 10th year. We provide cybersecurity solutions to defense and federal customers, as well as commercial entities worldwide. I'll give you another overview here in a second. But okay, so the purpose of this slide here is not to instill fear necessarily, but this was a quote that was given. It's a little dated now. It was given about 6 or 8 years ago, but essentially, former FBI Director Robert Mueller, when he was in office, said that there are 2 types of companies out there: those that have been hacked and those that will be. Now, people think that when they implement something like CMMC or an ISO 27001 program or cybersecurity services solution, something like that, that it's going to make them invulnerable to hacking and hackers and things like that. But these programs, the intention is not necessarily about making people invulnerable or invincible. It's about risk mitigation. So even if you are breached, the intent here is to mitigate the damages and contain them. Particularly under this program that we're talking about today, particularly for defense information, containing the breach, containing the information that's being exfiltrated, containing anything that could be a benefit to our nation's adversaries, essentially. So it's not necessarily going to say 100%, oh, implement this program and you'll never get breached. That's not really what it's saying. What it's saying is, yes, it's going to make you less of a soft target. 90% of the attackers out there are looking for soft targets. They're looking for companies that left their proverbial doors and windows unlocked, that they can walk right in the door undetected and walk out unscathed. But it's also just going to be, if you are the target of an advanced persistent threat, perhaps a nation state group or something like that, very hard to defend against those. But what you can do is you can mitigate the damage. You can prevent downtime and losses for your company. You can preserve your reputation in any market, essentially, but especially the DoD market, and you can protect yourself against losses of federal contracts and federal opportunities. So that's really what we're really talking about today. Again, Netizen Corporation, what we do here, we have a 24/7, 365 security operations center that essentially works as your outsourced eyes and ears for cybersecurity. In an environment and across your entire environment, across all locations, even different countries. We provide security engineering, which we classify as developing the solutions and implementing IT infrastructure, or identifying areas we can build and design and deploy IT infrastructure and solutions to better defend against attackers. Vulnerability assessments and penetration testing. Pretty self-explanatory, but essentially we're looking for those open doors and windows. We're looking for ways that an attacker would get into your environment, and we're just looking to see what an attacker sees when they probe you. And to anybody that thinks that they're not being probed by attackers or by even nation states at this point, especially if you have a DoD customer, I hate to say it, but you are. Absolutely every day, probably. A lot of our work is in the defense and federal space. Our biggest customers are the U.S. Army. We also have U.S. Navy, Department of Treasury, Department of Veterans Affairs, and a lot of other federal customers listed on our website. That's really where our focus started out. We've been very successful in the defense market. We do over 800 different types of assessments so far in the past 2 years alone. Under a program called NIST Risk Management Framework, but also for ISO 27001, FISMA, which is the Federal Information Security Management Act, and the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, as well as preemptive CMMC gap assessment. Our compliance support does everything from PCI DSS, which is payment card industry interchange compliance for credit cards and things like that. We've done HIPAA and high-tech compliance support, ISO 27001, and of course, going into CMMC. We have a couple product suites that we offer as well that support that. Overwatch Governance Suite is essentially a suite of products that protects your environment by giving you real-time threat and compliance data, as well as vulnerability results on an ongoing basis every single day. Instead of doing it just once or twice a year, you get it every single day. We also have a product called AutoStig that helps check the configuration of machines for compliance with federal requirements. Okay, so enough about us. So what is CMMC and what's it designed to do? The CMMC was developed in response to the 800-171 program, also called CUI or CDI, Covered Defense Information or Controlled Unclassified Information, to protect unclassified information in the DoD supply chain. Now, some people might ask, Why is it so important to protect information that's deemed unclassified? Because if you get enough of it together, you can get a picture of certain things, especially intellectual property. You can get a picture of things. You can get a picture of operations. You can get a picture of innovative and new and upcoming technologies that we may be trying to field. So even though the information may be unclassified, gathering enough of it could be a danger to national security. So they came up with these programs that protect unclassified information once they identify that there were severe risks in the information that's going out there that's not necessarily classified, but could be danger to national security. The intent of CMMC is to unify cybersecurity standards for defense contractors. So what's that mean? Right now, we have the NIST 800-171 program, which is CUI, CDI. It's all self-assessment. It is sort of a unifying standard, but there's no teeth. It really doesn't have any, you're kind of on your own to say whether you pass or fail. It's all trust-based. There's not a whole lot of validation going on, not a whole lot of trust to verify there. It's all trust, basically. And you can get yourself into trouble with that if you're the victim of a breach and they determine that you are negligent in implementing stuff that you told the federal government you were implementing. But in the meantime, there's nobody really doing any auditing. So what the DoD did is they said, okay, we need a uniform set of criteria of compliance metrics, they call controls and programs like that, to implement in order to kind of set the cybersecurity standard for the entire defense industry. The assessments were added to it. So you have assessments now for certain levels, which increases accountability in the marketplace. So no longer can you, or will you be able to really say, oh yes, of course, I implement multi-factor authentication. Of course, I FIPS 120 compliant encryption. You have to prove that this is there. And for certain levels, you're going to have to actually go through an audit to prove that it's there. But even for entry levels, you're going to have to provide evidence that you actually implemented. The new model of CMMC 2.0 gets away from the 5 levels that CMMC 1.0 had and condenses them down into 3 levels, essentially making things, I wouldn't say easier, but it makes it more capable of being managed, especially by mid-sized companies and smaller companies that are going to have requirements for CMMC. So they kind of streamline things quite a bit for CMMC 2.0. There's also a distinguish between federal contract information, FCI, and controlled unclassified information. So in the past, the actual contract information was not considered anything that needed to be necessarily protected to the highest degree, or to any degree, really. So if you're awarded a certain contract, and although it's public information, certain mods or awards or any kind of specifications and things you get through that contract wasn't really tracked as far as cybersecurity is concerned to the highest degree. CMMC version 2.0 adds in those controls to ensure that federal contract information is protected to the same level as controlled unclassified information. I will say this, there is a timeline for implementation of CMMC version 2.0. They finally come up with the standards. They're having the rulemaking body signing off on them now. And by, I believe, Tristan, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it's May 2025, they're looking for everybody to get CMMC implemented, whether you're a prime or a subcontractor within the Department of Defense. So it seems like a lot of time, but it's really not. And I'll go over some of the reasons why in a little bit. So again, here's the updates from 1.0 to 2.0. We streamlined levels from 3 to 5, or from 5 to 3 actually. We aligned the control families with NIST 800-171, which was the program that essentially was in place before this for controlled unclassified information. We added 60 NFO, which is non-federal organization controls, to level 2 and 3. These are controls that were not applicable necessarily to the federal government, but apply more to the private sector. So they were added to be more private sector focused. And instead of requiring audits for all levels, what they're doing now is they're allowing companies seeking level 1 in CMMC and some already in level 2 to achieve compliance through self-assessment. But these are not the same necessarily safe self-assessments that they are for the current program. So anybody that's familiar with or has heard about the NIST 800-171 program, they have a system called SPRS. And what you do is you download a spreadsheet and you tell them what you have implemented, and then you upload it and they give you a score. Now that's a self-assessment. For CMMC, even if you only go through self-assessment for level 1, you have to provide evidence. It's not just to check the box and say, yeah, I do it. You have to provide screenshots, you have to provide a document, you have to provide something that shows that you actually do it. And also to make it easier, they did reintroduce what's called POAMs. POAMs are, for those that don't know, they're called Plan of Action and Milestones. They're essentially a task list of items that still need to be fixed or corrected from a cybersecurity perspective to meet full compliance. But in place of that, you have mitigation procedures to kind of get around it, but still have a level of security that meets certain standards. And now you can have POAMs, instead of having to implement everything all up front, all at once. Now you kind of have POAMs to be able to say, okay, this is a larger project here. This is something that we're going to have to implement over a number of years, but here's the steps. Here's how we're going to do it. It's a project plan, essentially, or a milestone map to get to compliance using a plan of action and milestones. And it makes it easier, particularly for small and mid-sized businesses, where if you're required to get level 3, some of the stuff can be cost prohibitive done all up front. With the POAMs, they give you a little bit of leeway in that. They're not going to say, oh, you can't POAM everything. You can't go in there and say, oh, all my access control is POAM. We're not even using passwords. They're not going to allow you to do that. But if you say, okay, we're going to roll out multi-factor authentication for these applications, but we have to contract with a vendor and do X, Y, Z, as long as you have a plan in place, a discrete date to meet that and to get there, they're going to accept that. So with that being said, here's a little visual kind of representation of what happened. You have CMMC model 1.0 on the left, CMMC model 2.0 on the right. You see it condensed from the 5 down to 3. Level 1 is the entry level. It's perhaps the easiest to attain. It's self-assessment generally, but they still have certain controls in place. Like, you won't be required necessarily for multi-factor authentication or things like that, but you will be required to have incident response plans, and you will be required to do certain types of monitoring and things like that. But nothing extreme, nothing that's going to change your entire organization or impact business operations necessarily at level 1. And almost all subcontractors. So if you're a subcontractor on an unclassified problem or a program, you'll almost certainly be required for at least level 1, and it's considered foundational. The vast majority, if anybody's looking to sell products, services, especially manufacturing companies, if they're looking to sell products to the federal government, are going to be required for level 2 or even level 3. Level 3 is probably what they're going to require the most of for prime contractors. So if you have a prime contract to provide a certain type of bolt that goes into the landing gear of the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, they're going to require you to do like a level 3. And there's kind of a reason for that. So a few years back, we worked with a company. We were actually brought in by the FBI. What happened was they developed, it wasn't a company in this area, it was outside of this area, but they developed parts for the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. And it was a mundane part. It was something like a certain type of, excuse me, a certain type of aircraft or airframe bolt or nut and bolt system or something like that. It was very, very mundane. Now, they were breached. They tracked it all the way back to China. Now, okay, China got the design for one particular set of one particular assembly or a nut and bolt type thing that went into the landing gear of the F-35. Okay, so what? What happened? Remarkably, they did this to a lot of companies. They did it to a large number of manufacturing companies who were just not prepared. They were simply not prepared to protect themselves against these types of attacks and these kinds of breaches. They didn't have the security in place. They didn't have access control, basic things in place even. So now all of a sudden, the Chinese 5th generation fighters look remarkably like our own 5th generation fighters. That bolt for bolt almost in certain areas. They look almost identical. And then the DoD was kind of like, okay, well, that's odd. And then, you know, it had something to do with all these breaches, specifically manufacturing companies. They are especially China, is extremely interested in our intellectual property from this country. Being as innovative as we are, especially in the defense realm, it's a lot cheaper to steal than it is to create, and they have a tendency to kind of use that to their advantage. And they have the ability to take tiny little pieces from a multitude of companies and put them all together to form a big picture. And the next thing you know, all of their military hardware looks almost exactly like ours. Our most cutting edge stuff is rolling off the line in China all of a sudden. So we're protecting intellectual property with a lot of the CMMC stuff. And so that's why the DoD implemented this. They've been harping on industry, saying get better, get better, get better. We have standards that we follow here so that we don't get breached, especially with classified information. We need you to do the same. So they formed CMMC to do this. They came out with Model 1.0, which is good but a little flawed. 2.0 is much more streamlined, and that's where we're at now. So now that we know why it's there.
Yep. Michael. Yeah, I just wanted to, since you were talking of the level 1 and 2, and you mentioned that maybe the majority would be 3, is there some kind of rules of that as to how does a manufacturer know what they would need to meet?
It's going to be, so that's a great question. A lot of it's going to be contractually required. In the solicitations, when you're bidding on these particular things, if you're a prime vendor, which means you're a first position vendor, you're not a subcontractor to the federal government, I would almost assume you're going to be at least level 2, likely level 3. And it's going to be spelled out in the solicitation. So when you're bidding on this work and going after it, it's going to say, hey, you need to implement and you need to be assessed at level 2 or level 3 in order to win this contract or in order to hold this work. And then every 3 years, the federal government's going to come back and want to see your new assessment. They're going to say, okay, you were assessed at this 3 years ago. Where's your new assessment? So it'll be in the contract documents. And starting in May of this year, they're going to start putting the requirements in the contractual documents. So level 1, 2, and 3, you're going to start seeing them in the solicitations this year. So does that make sense?
Yes. And when I guess just a follow-up, so that I imagine that would be in the prime contract document from the DoD to that prime contractor. And is it then theoretically, if that prime contractor is doing any subcontracting for any of the work or smaller components or otherwise, that it would be their responsibility to then include that as appropriate in their contracts to their sub-tier suppliers?
Correct. There's the concept of what's called flow downs in the federal market. And the contracts or solicitations will often tell you exactly what has to be, what is a flow down. And they will cite specific regulations, specific requirements to say, okay, as a prime vendor, you're required to have level 3, subcontractors level 2 or level 1, whatever it may be. And they can specify that. And then the company that's the prime contractor can also specify in their subcontracts. So the flow downs would obviously have to be required in the subcontracts in accordance with the solicitation. In order to meet all the requirements or the award documents, you'll have to flow down those requirements to each subcontract and say, okay, you have to meet all these requirements, give me proof, or go through the system and get proof of, meeting these requirements. And then the subcontract or the prime contractors can also require it themselves at the same time, but they don't have the authority to require an assessment like the DoD does, but they can put it into the contract. Hey, you need to meet this level and be prepared for the assessment, basically. But yes, it'll flow mostly from the federal government in the form of these contract requirements that'll go to the prime, and the prime's required to flow them down to the sub.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. All right. So, what are some of the steps to repair? Now, before I get into all this, I do want to go over one thing here. It's not a pitch, but it's not really a warning, but it's kind of like, I know there's going to be about 2.5 years before all this is required. That doesn't mean, we should start 3 months before it's required and jump on it and get in place then. And I'll be honest with you, if you're doing stuff about 3 months out, and even if you're just a mid-size or even some small tier, smaller level manufacturers, if you're waiting till the last minute, a lot of companies are going to charge you in the 6-figure range to meet compliance for levels 2 and 3. Because there's a ton of documentation and things that have to be in place. If you're doing things progressively now, if you're saying, okay, I'm going to implement my incident response plan, my system security plan, and take a look, maybe do a gap assessment right now. If you're doing that, say in the first year, then the second year you implement, some of the controls, and you start doing another gap assessment. If you start doing that now, it's remarkably less expensive than waiting till the last minute. There are a lot of companies out there that will take advantage, but it's not even really taking advantage. It's the fact that companies are getting in line now to get these assessments 2 years from now. There's not a lot of certified CMMC 3.0s, they call them out there. And there's more waiting in line, but they're at the mercy of the CMMC board. So a lot of companies are getting in line now and saying, hey, I'm going to need this in 2 years. Let's start now so that I'm not scrambling 3 months from when it's required and spending $150,000, $200,000 to implement all this stuff all at once because I have nothing in place. So it's very important to start early and do updates often. Keep checking in, keep doing things. Once a quarter, you should review your current status and what you've implemented, what you've done. And I know it's really hard to get over especially in business, you get focused on so many. I know that for a fact, being a business owner, you get focused on so many different things that it pulls you away. But this is one of those things where you can save a lot of money in the long run by doing things incrementally, doing an annual gap assessment, different things like that, and implementing some of these things in piecemeal rather than waiting for the last minute and saying, oh, okay, my contracting officer is requiring it. I got to set aside $150,000 to get this done. So first things you can do is determine what level your firm must adhere to. Now, again, a lot of this is going to be driven by the needs that are specified in the solicitation. So you're going to have the CMMC requirements in the solicitation, in the contract document saying, hey, you need to adhere to this, you need to provide an audit for this, all that stuff. But what you can assume right now is if you're a subcontractor, I would assume at least level 1, get the level 1 stuff in place, the 17 controls that are there, start getting that rolling, start documenting it. If you're a prime contractor, prime vendor to the Department of Defense, I would plan at least level 2 and 3 and to start working with a company that can perform the CMMC assessments or at least the gap analysis to get things rolling now so you're not waiting till the last minute. So again, subcontractor, assume at least level 1, but you could have requirements for level 2 or 3 depending on the type of contract and the type of equipment or material you're creating for the Department of Defense. Prime contractor, you can assume at least level 2 or possibly level 3. I would look heavily at level 3 because all the guidance that I've seen so far is pointing heavily towards level 3 and getting that assessment. So that's how you can kind of determine right up front exactly what you think you must adhere to and where you can get started by knowing who your customer is, if your end customer is DoD or your end customer is another company that works for the DoD. You want to review applicable controls. Controls are just essentially the IT speak for different types of processes, technologies that you put in place to mitigate risk. So you have access control, like you have passwords, they have to be a certain strength, they have to change every 90 days. Multi-factor authentication, where they have a text message or use an authenticator app on your phone. Physical security, making sure your buildings are locked, things like that. And telework, a lot of people are working remote now. How are you securing your information on remote desktops and remote laptops and personal devices, BYOD, bring your own device? How are you securing that information? So you want to review the controls based on what level you're looking at. So your level 1, there's those 17 controls. Level 3, there's a lot more, like 160 or so. You want to review what's applicable to you and then how you're going to implement that. And then you want to assess your current security posture and identify gaps. Now, a gap assessment is basically, it's like a mini audit, but it's not as thorough. Somebody comes in and they're going to interview your people. They'll ask questions. They'll say, okay, you identify suspicious activity in this environment. What do you do? How do you respond? And how did you identify it? They will say, okay, do you have, X, Y, Z in place? Do you have technology to monitor or check vulnerabilities? And basically, it's kind of checking the box, going down, looking for evidence that certain things are implemented. And a gap assessment, not as thorough as an audit or an assessment, but it is definitely the first step to take. For anybody that's done assessment programs or platforms for other types of compliance programs like ISO or anything like that, you can do a gap assessment ahead of time, save a ton of headache later on. It's like the pre-test to the test. Once you do the gap assessment, create a plan or a timeline to implement those technical controls. So you want to say, okay, this is where your POAMs come in. This is where your different milestones, your project plan comes in, and say, okay, well, we identified a gap where we have essentially these these manufacturing machines that are running on outdated software, but they're accessible through a network they really shouldn't be, and that could be an issue when it comes for our assessment time. Now, the DoD really doesn't. They're not going to say, oh, change all your business operations, but they will say you need to secure these things, mitigate the risk, and say, okay, so for a plan of action milestone, we need to separate these machines onto a completely different network that's not internet accessible and only accessible to the technicians that need to access the machines and update the software on them, things like that, so that they can't be reached from the outside. Different plans like that, just come up with something. The gap analysis will help you develop this, and it'll point you in the right direction. Documentation. These programs are heavy on documentation. SSP is a system security plan. IRP is incident response plan. Basically, if you identify or believe you're the victim of a breach, you have ransomware in your environment or something like that, how do you respond? And it's something that not just executives will be responsible for, end users should know it as well. As soon as they identify that, okay, their machine was infected with ransomware, what do? You disconnect it from the network? Do you contact somebody? How do you report that? How do you do it? And it's going to be based on your own policies and procedures, and you develop those along with an independent company to document everything. And then you're going to be assessed on not only the documentation, but how well you adhere to that documentation. So your own policies and procedures. Just because you wrote it down doesn't mean you'll get a passing grade on a CMMC assessment. It means that they're going to require you to prove that you're actually doing it. So hardware, software lists as well. Yeah, everybody's probably familiar with inventory sheets, inventory lists, or what they call in the federal government a BOM, bill of materials. And essentially, you should have lists of everything in your environment. There should not be a rogue Wi-Fi router out there that somebody brought in from home. There should not be, machines on your environment that you're unfamiliar with and have no idea where they came from. There should be a hardware software list, and it includes software too. So the software that's existing on all your company equipment and everything should be inventoried, so you know what's out there. So you know that somebody's not downloading a type of software that's going to remove data from your environment without your knowledge. So you create these lists so you can identify that. And this helps other companies come in, and when they do their assessment, they can scan for these things, and they can scan for things that aren't supposed to be there to make sure that you're adhering to that list and making sure that you're enforcing that list. And I talked about the third-party gap assessment. That's absolutely crucial. I can't really emphasize it enough that these gap assessments done early and often will save a ton of time, money, and headaches. They will point you in the right direction, and they'll give you so much clarity on what these programs are and which direction you should go based on the type of company you have, based on the type of customers you have, and based on where you want to go in the future as well. Definitely highly recommend everybody start with at least an entry-level initial assessment for a certain level of CMMC. It can be done in a matter of weeks. You get a report, you get somebody to sit down with you and tell you exactly what's going on, what needs to be done, and everything like that, and then you go from there. You have a plan. That's all you need. So you're not surprised when things show up later. So, yeah, with that, I kind of went kind of fast over some of it, but that was an overview of what's coming, what's new, and some of the recommendations. So I don't know if you want to open it up for questions or anything.
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. Thanks so much for that presentation. One question that we've got, you touched on a couple product solutions that you have, like the Overwatch Governance Suite. Are any of those kind of those enclave types to it, where they're able to meet all the CMMC controls, or can you touch on those a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to try to be as product or company agnostic as I can. So not one piece of software will almost never, probably never, meet all the required controls for an environment. So you have different types of tools that do different things from a cybersecurity perspective. So our Overwatch suite does compliance tracking and it does vulnerability management. So if you're at level 1 or even level 2, and you need the vulnerability assessments and you need to prove a report to show, okay, these are my vulnerabilities, this is how I'm fixing them, this is the environment, that's what that does. Now, AutoStig checks the configuration of the machine. So they have different configuration requirements. Say, okay, this machine's secure in accordance with this requirement, and things like that. On top of that, there's other software called SIEM, Security Information and Event Management. We use a product called Waza, but there's also Graylog, there's Splunk. They range in cost from basically free for the software, but it costs money to set up, to tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. Like Splunk is pretty expensive, but it's pretty nice. And basically that watches your network infrastructure for any kind of anomalous activity, and it meets a different subset of controls. So it's going to be kind of a patchwork of different software. And then you're going to have antivirus for endpoint protection and things like that. So it's going to be a patchwork of different things. And that's why, you know, if you have a complex environment, having a security operations center that you can outsource to manage all that for you and just give you reports and then respond in 3 a.m. when China's knocking at the door, that's usually the most beneficial thing.
Great. And just last one, I'm sure is probably the first question you always get from companies when you start talking with them. But from in your experience, I mean, and how do you answer the question? You know, what's this gonna cost to meet all these requirements?
Yeah, and yeah, it's a great question. We get that a lot, and you know, it's probably some of the cost is going to be built into the contracts when you're selling your products. Take into account what exactly is the cost for these types of things, and you can work with a company up front to identify what the cost would be. And it's going to vary widely by how complex your environment is, how many sites, what types of products you create. But you could do gap assessments for as little as, you know, $5,000 to $10,000 that give you a direction and tell you where you're going, where you need to be. You do that once a year. You can implement the documentation relatively quick and easy in piecemeal. And the assessments are probably going to be the most expensive part of one-time cost. Depending, again, it's going to vary so wildly on the size of your environment. And it's also going to vary based on how prepared you were. So the assessments can range anywhere from $25,000 to $500,000, depending on how prepared you are. And that's why having these, you know, a $5,000 or $10,000 gap assessment up front could save you $100,000 2 years from now. So it's not necessarily the cheapest program. And, you know, I'm sure you're going to have to price in a lot of the stuff when you're billing to the government for some of these things, but once it's implemented, it's easier to maintain. And if you start early and keep it updated and keep going at it, it's remarkably cheaper than waiting for the last minute, implementing everything all at once and spending, you know, $250,000 on it. You know, you could spend $25,000 or $50,000 on it and have the same result.
Well, some great recommendations, Michael. So yeah, thank you once again for joining us today and giving us this update on CMMC 2.0. And just as a reminder for everyone, this will be recorded and up on our website, aimhigherconsortium.org. So with that, I'd like to thank you once again for joining us, Michael.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you having me.
All right. Thanks, and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks.